racial notions. And I put it that way because I'm a race skeptic. I think that the very notion of race is not only an empty fiction, but an extremely toxic and destructive one.
Yes.
I would just like to put it, I agree with you 100% on that. And I think that anybody who still actually uses the word, it's so unscientific that there's no such thing.
So what we need to do, if we're trying to look at, even a race skeptic like myself grants that notions of race have played a huge and uniquely terrible role in human history and society. So that makes it worth studying. And so the first stop has to be, well, how does the concept of race work? What's being talked about? Now, any analysis of that has got to cover all the cases. And that includes, say, the attitude in the Christian world towards Jewish people in, say, the Middle Ages, let's say the 14th century. Now, and the attitude, of course, in the Christian world to Jewish people, I'm Jewish, by the way, to people during the 20th century, for Christ's sake, amongst white supremacists now and Nazis back in the 30s and 40s and so on.
And right? Gaza rears its head right now.
And Gaza, yes. And Gaza, both sides, by the way.
Yes. Can I just?
We got racialization on both sides.
Yes.
And it must include, say, people like my maternal grandmother, who was a Romanian Jew, had very pale skin, had very blue eyes, had very blonde hair. So, look, given my grandmother's appearance, for example, and the general fact that Jewish people are indistinguishable from, I mean, the Nazis had this ridiculous project of trying to find biological markers for Judaism, which failed utterly.
Yes,
because Jews were indistinguishable outwardly from anyone they consider, members of the master race.
Until you take the boys' trousers off, of course.
Yeah, but of course, that's not an inherent characteristic.
No. You're not born like that.
You're not born like that. That's correct. That was the practice. That was the Nazi practice. It didn't work with females, though, of course.
No.
So look, let's cut to the chase. The way I think that race works, the idea of race is that there are a small number of fundamentally different kinds of people. Membership in one of these categories is determined by descent. So you're the race of one or both of your parents. Different societies work it differently.
Yes.
So in the United States, for instance, in the Deep South, there was the one-drop rule. If you had a single black ancestor, of course, all of us have had black ancestors.
Yes.
You were black. So those are the two things. And the third is the idea of hierarchy.
Yes.
Right? Like there are higher races and lower races. Now, what's the connection between appearance then and skin color? Let me just make this final point.
Yeah.
Or else I'll forget where I am. I think that the way race works is that appearance is taken to be symptomatic of something deeper. But race itself is supposed to be the possession of this deeper something, this fundamental difference.
Right.
That accounts for my grandmother, right? And indeed the idea that Jews were very adept at deceiving Christians about their true nature because they, looking at them, you usually couldn't tell them apart. And it also accounts for the phenomenon of passing, that someone racialized as black, say, who has fair skin, might pass themselves off as white, but would still be, if they were found out, the idea was that they're really black.
And that happened in South Africa.
It happens in every racist regime.
Yes, and of course it works in reverse too, because there was this woman in the States who was very white but was passing herself off as black.
Yeah, there are a few examples of that historically. There was a Greek musician
Mm.
who did like jazz, and he
Yes.
found it advantageous for his career. You know, he is quite dark skinned
Yes.
to do that. But for obvious reasons, it tends not to go in that direction because
Yes.
the
Mm.
subordinate group, it's in their interests, of course,
Yeah.
to have a decent life and not to be oppressed.
Yes, indeed. Yes. So I wanted to just touch on the idea of, because you were saying about the hereditary aspect of this, and we talked about different cultures,
Mhm.
but we didn't mention the different lineage, too, because some cultures are matrilineal, and most cultures, I think, are patrilineal.
Yes, that's right. There's some are matrilineal and some are
Yes.
patrilineal. Yeah.
So that makes a big difference anyway, doesn't it? I mean, aren't we in the territory of mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome?
Well, I think the thing to bear in mind is that if we're still talking about race,
Yes,
and we can contrast race with ethnicity in a moment,
yes,
the whole race thing is nonsense, right?
yes,
So,
yes,
so anything we say about mitochondrial DNA versus, nuclear DNA is actually irrelevant. The people who would promote racial ideas would tell you, though that's not the case, that
yes.
there is no genetic justification of any sort
For any sort of race.
for
Indeed.
any
Okay.
racial division.
Yes,
David,
Yeah.
at the risk of going into semantics, although I do think semantics are quite important,
Me too.
where does ethnicity come into the game?
Ethnicity is culture.
Okay.
So I'm thinking of there's a wonderful woman in Australia. She was born actually. She's South Sudanese. She was born in a refugee camp, and she's become a fairly prominent lawyer and an activist. And she describes herself as an Australian of African appearance, which I think is a really wonderful way of putting it. So her ethnicity, if you want to say that, well, it's a combination. She has elements in her ethnicity of a South Sudanese ethnicity. There are many South Sudanese ethnicities, right?
yes,
And also as an Australian. I say part of my ethnicity is Ashkenazi Jewish, and much more of it is simply being an American.
uh-huh.
Ethnicities are not thought of, or should not be thought of, as in any sense innate. They're adopted. If I as a child had been adopted by a Chinese family, my ethnicity would be Chinese, right? They can be acquired and they can be
Yes,
unacquired. Whereas the idea of race it's like a life sentence.
yes,
Though
Inherent.
in many cultures, and I'm talking as a South African, I think race and ethnicity had become conflated.
That's correct.
I think that happens, and I think that is part of the dehumanization process that we talk about, because to acknowledge ethnicity is, in my opinion, probably it should be fine. There shouldn't be any problem with it. But they began to conflate this myth of race with ethnicity, and in some countries in the world more so than in others. And I think that contributes to the conflation of those two ideas, which one definitely has value and is real, which is ethnicity if it is expressed as culture, which I think it is, but then to conflate that with this idea of race.
You're absolutely right, Tercia. The ethnicities are very easily racialized. But that process is the outcome of social forces that make it convenient for that to happen. So in the United States, the category Hispanic or Latino has become racialized. The category Muslim has become racialized. It happens a lot, and to such and it's not helped by the fact that people often use the word ethnicity as a euphemism.
Yes, they do. Can I say that these things are all right if they're self-chosen, but it's the imposition of a label onto somebody else that's obnoxious.
Yeah, and the problem, of course, is that these things are typically or very often imposed on children before they're in a position to
Yes.
test, and built into their identities.
Yes.
Yes. So that's a real problem, because then challenging some of these notions of race feels like an attack. It feels like you're
Yes.
trying to take away something that's important to a person for their sense of who they are.
Especially in the world today where so many of us are obviously hybrids.
Well, all of us are. Go back 10 generations. And the ancestry just ramifies outward.
But for a while, it wasn't so obvious, was it? Because the world wasn't so mixed up. We had pockets of Western Europeans and Ashkenazi Jews, for example. Yes. But since the jumbo jet, we've all interbred. And so more of us...
We were intervening long before that. I mean, there are often barriers, to some extent geographical barriers, although the evidence is population has flowed around those. So, for instance, the Sahara only became desertified maybe 6,000 years ago.
Yes.
So even these barriers, people overestimate them. There certainly have been cultural barriers.
Yes.
Jews in Europe, unless the women were raped by Christians, basically it was endogamous, right? Jews reproduce with Jews, but that was because of cultural barriers. That was because of ideologies of segregation.
Yes, which is the same ideology that makes quite a lot of Pakistanis marry their cousins.
Yes, sure.
Yeah,
and it's a terrible shame, I think.
Yes, indeed.